Hey heroes, welcome to another incredible episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/merrymarvelade. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Today we're looking at the origin and early history of the superhuman psychiatrist Doc Samson, as well as some other relevant or related stories. We don't exactly have a full account of his childhood or his upbringing, but some details have been gleaned from several different sources. He was actually born Leonard Skavorsky Jr. in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The name Samson was apparently a nickname that his mother applied to his father due to his long hair. Leo Skavorsky Sr. was a successful psychiatrist. He published one of the first comprehensive studies on eating disorders, which may have contributed to the fact that a large number of the patients who visited his practice were young women, which is something his son took note of. A boy of Jewish descent, Len Jr. reportedly attended yeshiva and had little interest in following in his father's footsteps. As an adult, he moved to New York and changed his name to Leonard Samson, thus dropping the Jr. But you know what they say about apples and trees, and like his father, Samson earned his PhD in psychiatry, although he did have a penchant for other sciences. He became a doctor of some repute, spending several years as a lecturer and speaking on the importance of professional ethics. During one such talk at a convocation in Chicago, one of the doctors in attendance was Carla Sofin, who would later become the villainous Moonstone. Samson had several love interests at different times, one of which was a woman named Delia Childress, who he nicknamed Delilah. However, Delia was frustrated by both Samson and her own father being overbearing and controlling influences on her life. The situation ended badly when Delia was injured in a motorcycle accident while rebelling against the two men. She survived, but her right leg was crippled, leaving her reliant on a cane, and she ended her relationship with Samson. At some point, he romanced another woman named Sandra Verdugo on a trip to Argentina. The details of that relationship are unclear, but she was a former Special Forces operative working as a mercenary at the time, and unbeknownst to Samson, was pregnant with his child when they parted ways. But Doc Samson's introduction to the Marvel Universe as a whole is largely tied to the Green Goliath known as the Incredible Hulk. And so as we pivot to those events, let's first set the scene by introducing some other characters relevant to the drama. Of course, there's Bruce Banner, the nuclear physicist who transforms into the gamma-powered monster, Thunderbolt Ross, the grizzled US Air Force general who battled the Hulk multiple times over the years, and finally, Betty Ross, the general's daughter and Bruce Banner's love interest. See, things really started when Betty was forced to trade blood with the villainous Sandman. In an earlier battle with the Hulk, the Sandman had fallen into a high-pressure vat that turned him into living glass. He was able to change back with the help of his ally, the Wizard, but his powers remained unstable. In order to fully recover, he required a full blood transfusion, and Betty was a matching type. This caused her to turn to glass instead, and since she lacked Sandman's powers, she was unable to move or speak. And that's where Leonard Samson enters the picture, hired by General Ross after approaching him with a plan to help cure Betty. This plan was based around an experimental device he'd overseen the creation of using the nation's top technicians, the cathexis ray. But first he needed to get Bruce Banner on board, convincing him that Betty needed his help. He programmed the cathexis ray to drain the Hulk's psychic energy and use it to restore Betty, simultaneously curing Banner, because that's how that works. Putting aside the science behind the process, the plan worked, with excess gamma radiation stored in the machine. But that left Samson wondering, if a gamma explosion could turn someone into a rampaging Hulk, what result might be achieved from a more controlled burst? He decided to test this on himself, using the cathexis ray to bathe himself in a calculated amount of radiation. The effects were instant, but perhaps not as pronounced as the other Gamma mutates like the Hulk, the Abomination, or the Leader. In those other cases, their skin turned completely green, but for Samson it was only his hair that changed to a verdant hue, growing longer as well. Not only that, but his muscle mass increased as well, pushing his strength to superhuman levels. As for why he performed such a risky experiment, well, it likely stems from a subconscious lust for power, a desire to be a superhero that was made even more prominent by his transformation. With his increased strength, speed, and agility, he put together a brightly colored costume and was henceforth known as Doc Samson. However, he also desired Betty Ross and began romancing her. The situation resulted in jealousy and frustration from Banner, who decided to take drastic measures in retaliation. Sneaking into Samson's lab, he transformed himself back into the Incredible Hulk, which of course led to a confrontation between Samson and the Hulk. While the Doc put up a good fight, the Hulk's strength only increased with rage and he quickly overpowered him. The ironic thing is that while Samson was initially wooing Betty, she was more in love with Bruce, wishing that he would call her. But after Banner turned back into the Hulk, it was Leonard's side she rushed to. I suppose sometimes it's better to talk to the people you care about than to try and solve all your problems by transforming into an enormous green rage monster. Anyway, Len subsequently tested his powers and realized that, much like the biblical Samson, his strength was determined by the length of his hair. And he later aided the Hulk against a much more sinister Gamma mutate, the Leader. During that battle, Samson took part of a deadly radiation blast that was meant for the Hulk. While he survived and recovered, he was ultimately depowered by the ray's effects. After that, Samson went under the radar for a time and Betty married another man, Major Glenn Talbot. He was later rendered comatose during a convoluted conflict with the Russian villain known as the Gremlin. And so Leonard Samson was brought back into the fold, called by General Ross to help revive Talbot. Of course, fate is a funny thing, and during this time, Samson was bathed in Gamma once again during a lab accident. This reactivated his powers, transforming him back into the green-haired Doc Samson. He's pretty much remained Gamma-powered ever since then, and of course has had many other encounters with the Hulk over the years. He also made further advances towards Betty while her husband was unconscious. However, he did indeed help revive him in a plan that involved shrinking the Hulk to microscopic size, and having him physically punch out the mental block that was preventing Talbot from awakening, because that's how that works. The Hulk even had to fight illusory enemies generated by Talbot's memories while he was physically inside his brain, and the whole thing was wild. But the science behind that process aside, that plan worked. Talbot revived, and Samson lost Betty for good. For a while he didn't do much superheroing, mostly aiding Thunderbolt Ross and his Hulk busters at Gamma Base. Although there was an incident in which he battled the Rhino, a villain who'd fought both the Hulk and Spider-Man. That was after he found an amnesiac man wandering the desert and was attempting to help him. That man eventually turned out to be the Leader, who was able to restore himself to his Gamma mutate form. And so Doc Samson joined forces with the Hulk to battle their mutual foe once again. But in the aftermath of that conflict, the Hulk turned on Samson and went on another rampage. When he ultimately changed back to human form, Samson offered to help him with his psychological issues. Thus, he attempted to analyze both the man and the monster. Soon he saw that the Hulk wasn't simply a form that Banner took, but a separate persona indicative of dissociative identity disorder, and Samson took a personal interest in him. Although further attempts to analyze the Hulk were met with resistance and hostility. He made efforts to befriend the Green Goliath, but had a little success earning his trust. He nearly made headway at one point, but was thwarted by the supervillain Moonstone, secretly psychiatrist Dr. Carla Sofin, who we mentioned earlier. Her schemes also caused General Ross to have a nervous breakdown, leaving him hospitalized and Samson temporarily in charge of Gamma Base. Although he did gladly turn that position over to Major Talbot to focus on helping Ross recover. By that point, he and Betty had separated, and Talbot's own obsession with defeating the Hulk would later cost him his own life. Samson, meanwhile, encountered his old girlfriend, Delia Childress, who had joined Advanced Idea Mechanics and sworn revenge on him. Using AIM devices, she attempted to steal the secret of his powers and drive him mad in the process. Ultimately, her plans were thwarted and her hired muscle, the Rhino, was defeated by Samson and Spider-Man. Samson also promised to help cure Delia of her own madness, but her subsequent fate is unconfirmed. In the meantime, since leaving Gamma Base, he had taken up a teaching position at Northwestern University in Illinois. He subsequently jumped back to New Mexico to confront the Hulk at the site of the Gamma Bomb accident. This time, the submerged Banner persona aided Samson by causing the Hulk to hallucinate old foes. That allowed Samson to knock out the Hulk long enough to subject him to another experiment. Using a specialized nutrient bath, he was able to separate Banner and the Hulk into two separate physical entities because that's how that works. While the Hulk's personality had varied over the years with differing levels of articulation, the Hulk who emerged from the nutrient bath was effectively mindless. While Samson wished to educate and rehabilitate the creature, it was soon taken captive by the government agency S.H.I.E.L.D. Samson freed the monster while it was in transit, but the Hulk then proceeded to fly into a completely mindless rage and destroy the town of Stone Ridge, New Mexico. Now, this brings up an interesting point about the Hulk's rampage. Something that was later explained by the super genius Amadeus Cho is that the Hulk's rampages generally don't result in much loss of life. There are certainly sources that contradict this, and there are definitely examples of various incarnations of the Hulk killing people, but generally speaking, his death toll is significantly lower than one might expect, because the Hulk is subconsciously using math and physics to avoid harming innocent civilians. In this example, though, the Stone Ridge rampage is another matter entirely. In this instance, where there was no mind, the property damage was over $1 billion and hundreds of people were killed. And that blood is effectively on Samson's hands, since he was the one who caused all of the circumstances that allowed it to happen. Several Avengers attempted to intercede, but their attempts to stop the Hulk arguably resulted in even more damage. And so Samson intervened, sporting a new costume and this mullet ponytail combo. A look that I would describe as the second biggest tragedy to happen that day. In any event, Samson attempted to atone for his mistakes by halting the Hulk's rampage himself. Meanwhile, Banner assembled a new team of Hulkbusters to destroy his former alter ego. Samson, though, was attacked by this team after he destroyed a Hulk training robot belonging to them, thinking it was the real thing. This resulted in yet another death, a Hulkbuster named Carolyn Parmenter, when her vehicle crashed during the battle. Although I wouldn't really put that one on Samson's feet, since it was friendly fire that damaged the craft and the Hulkbusters were the one who attacked him in the first place. Nonetheless, another Hulkbuster, Samuel LaRoquette, blamed Doc Samson for Parmenter's death. Little bit of a side note, he sought revenge on both Samson and the Hulk, but eventually he was captured and brainwashed by the leader. Given a shape-shifting stone exoskeleton, he became the supervillain known as Rock, and partnered with another former Hulkbuster, Redeemer. But anyway, back to the story at hand, neither Samson nor the Hulkbusters were capable of defeating the rampaging Hulk. More and more Avengers joined the fray, desperately trying to stop the unyielding monster. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on, Banner married Betty Ross himself, because why not do that now? However, he soon started losing molecular cohesion due to being separated from the Hulk. At the same time, this was also happening to the Hulk, and although Bruce was willing to sacrifice himself, Betty and Samson refused to just let him die. And so they convinced the Vision to use his own control over density to rejoin Banner and the Hulk, because that's how that works. Well, actually, it didn't work quite as well as they'd hoped, because while it did restore the Hulk's mind, the process had some pretty horrifying side effects, with Banner's body still existing within the Hulk's. Samson attempted to cure this condition with another nutrient bath, but General Ross interfered in an attempt to kill the Hulk once and for all. The end result of all of this scientific tomfoolery was the return of the original gray-skinned Hulk. For those who may not be aware, when the Hulk first emerged all those years ago, he was quite different from the one Samson initially encountered. He was notably smaller back then, nowhere near as powerful. And while he was more thoughtful and verbose, he was also more brutish, at times bordering on malicious. One of the more pronounced differences was that instead of stress or injury causing the transformation, Banner would always become the Hulk at night. But before long, his skin shifted in color and the Hulk slowly transitioned from that original persona to his classic Green Hulk form. Anyway, the returned Grey Hulk went on to have a series of adventures, and even spent some time as a hired goon in Las Vegas under the name Joe Fixit. During this time, Doc Samson began treating other superhuman patients like the eccentric Captain Ultra, but he eventually tracked down and confronted the Hulk, still wanting to help Banner. While the two were now closer in strength, the Grey Hulk still defeated Samson and delighted in mocking him. However, the psychiatrist was finally able to convince Bruce to let him try treating him again. With the help of supervillain hypnotist Maynard Tybalt, the Ringmaster, Doc Samson was able to have a therapy session within Banner's mind where he spoke with Bruce, the Grey Hulk, and the Green Hulk. He was able to get to the root of Banner's psychological issues, childhood trauma from his abusive father, Brian. He learned that when Bruce's mother tried to take her son and escape, Brian threw her to the ground, killing her in front of Bruce. And in this mindscape, Brian was represented by a monstrous entity typically referred to as the Guilt Hulk. Confronting this trauma and making peace with it seemingly had the result of merging Banner's three primary personas into one. This resulted in the emergence of a new Hulk form, sometimes called the Professor, which, unlike the previous Hulks, fully considered himself to actually be Bruce Banner. Following this, Leonard continued to offer support to Bruce and his allies. Another person he was hired to analyze was a criminal vigilante named Leslie Ann Shape. She carved an infinity symbol into her first victim, wanting her code name to be Infinity, but police on the scene misread it and the media dubbed her Crazy 8. She primarily targeted criminals and mobsters, but eventually killed a senator named Ray Hartwell. Authorities also found Hartwell's wife Beth battered and deduced that Shape had attacked her too. After the killer was arrested, the defense argued that she lacked an understanding of right and wrong. And so the district attorney called in Doc Samson to determine the validity of this claim, thus determining whether or not she would receive the death penalty. During their session, Shape acted flirtatiously unhinged towards Samson, but he saw her supposed craziness as just that, an act. While testifying, he was basically forced to admit that while her morals were abhorrent, she was fully cognizant and in control of her actions. Following Crazy 8's execution, Doc Samson saw Ray Hartwell's wife grieving and saying that she should be the one dead. As it turns out, Leslie Shape and Beth Hartwell were old friends, having known each other since high school. And it wasn't Leslie who caused Beth's injuries, but Beth's abusive husband, Ray. Beth reached out to Leslie for help, even offering to pay her, and thus Leslie killed Ray Hartwell. She admitted this to Samson, who left the scene trying to process everything that he just learned. Following that, Doc Samson had a number of other adventures and appearances. He was hired by Dr. Valerie Cooper to assess the members of the government-sanctioned mutant team X Factor. There was an expedition to the jungle in which he was mind-controlled by interdimensional aliens. but broke free thanks to the X-Man Wolverine, returned the favor by helping him foil the alien plot, and there was a time he observed an experimental procedure using a sort of gamma virus to unlock repressed emotions as a form of therapy. During that demonstration, an accident caused Samson to be infected and go on a rampage, which was then halted by Spider-Man and the Hulk. While Leonard recovered, the virus passed to the Hulk, and so then Spider-Man and Doc Samson had to stop him. During the Hulk's ordeals with a group called the Pantheon, Samson continued trying to treat him for his mood swings, but Bruce would continually attend the sessions remotely as a hologram rather than show up in person. Eventually deciding that he wasn't wanted, Samson planned on saying goodbye and leaving. However, that was shortly after the Hulk visited an imperfect future where he battled a sadistic dictatorial version of himself called the Maestro. And so after witnessing that, the Hulk actually asked Samson to stay and help him. In another incident, Samson encountered a young woman named Dee Dee Dearborn, ironically her real name being Delilah, who had the ability to copy the gamma powers of those around her. When they first met, she had emulated the form of the monstrous Patchwork serial killer. Samson helped her regain a more human form by letting her latch onto his gamma signature instead, mimicking his powers. Dearborn took the code name Geiger, and after the real Patchwork was defeated, Samson gave her a lock of his hair just in case she ever needed it to maintain her form. Geiger fell into obscurity after that, but she did pop up years later as part of the government's initiative program. In the meantime, the Hulk largely gave up on Samson's therapy after Betty's apparent death from radiation poisoning. Initially, Banner believed this to have been his own fault, but later discovered that it was caused by his old enemy, the Abomination. Sometime after that, when Bruce started showing symptoms of ALS, he sought help from a neurologist named Dr. Angela Lipscomb. She was a woman that Banner had dated during his college years, but at this point was running an Institute of Neuromuscular Psychiatry. While attempting to treat his condition, she learned of his various Hulk personas. And it was during this time that Bruce became aware of yet another persona, a demonic one that he kept locked away in the depths of his mind. This Devil Hulk was constructed as a protective father figure, but represented Bruce's most spiteful and merciless traits. Angela also noticed that Bruce wasn't truly in control of the Professor Hulk persona, but rather this form was yet another alter in the system. When she confronted Samson with this, he admitted that he'd lied to Bruce, letting him believe that his identity disorder had been cured. However, she ultimately understood that he did what he thought was right since his actions allowed a more intelligent and heroic Hulk to be in control, rather than his savage or sadistic counterparts. Samson and Lipscomb also grew close and started dating, but eventually broke up. In the meantime, Banner's ALS was cured with a procedure that was concocted by the leader, overseen by Mr. Fantastic, and performed by Ant-Man. Basically, the size-changing hero shrank down small enough to hand-repair Banner's DNA using samples harvested from his father's corpse, because that's how that works. Anyway, sometime later, Samson was drawn into a complicated conspiracy when an organization called Home Base sought his help in finding the Hulk. Around the same time, the Hulk was being framed for the death of a boy named Ricky Myers. In truth, Ricky had been kidnapped and held captive by Home Base. That was also done to compel Ricky's mother, Sandra Verdugo, into their service, transferring her mind into a superhuman clone body. They also covertly abducted Samson and implanted a camera in his right eye, but their attempts to use him as an unwilling spy were thwarted by some clever planning and a simple eye patch. Sandra also allied with Bruce against Home Base and revealed to Samson that Ricky was his son. The whole complicated conspiracy also involved a seemingly resurrected Betty Ross. But because her appearance there doesn't seem to gel that well with her apparent death and eventual return as the Red She-Hulk, it's entirely possible that this Betty was actually some sort of clone, especially since Home Base was using that kind of technology. Anyway, when Home Base's home base later self-destructed in a nuclear explosion, it seemingly took both Sandra and Ricky with it. I say seemingly because official guidebooks have not stated definitively that they perished, but neither have been seen since, and so their ultimate fate is technically unconfirmed. Samson and Betty escaped the blast and later discovered that the mastermind behind the whole home base conspiracy was actually a disembodied leader who wished to create a clone of the Hulk to use as a new body for himself. That plan was of course thwarted as well, but of course he later found other means of return. Now, that's pretty much all I've got time for this week, but there are, of course, other stories involving Doc Samson and the Hulk that I could cover in the future. Given what we touched on today, it seems like a video covering the Red Hulks would be appropriate at some point. In the meantime, if you want to read more for yourself and you don't mind a book with some horrific imagery, I definitely recommend The Immortal Hulk by Al Ewing and Joe Bennett. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!